At the end of Part 2, a flag rose. In Part 3, watch what happened to the people who raised it.
The Nigerian federal government, under Gowon, viewed the declaration in starkly different terms, not as a justified act of self-preservation, but as an illegal secession that threatened the survival of the Nigerian state itself, and one that, if allowed to succeed, could trigger the disintegration of the entire federation along ethnic lines. Within weeks, federal troops moved into the eastern region. The Nigerian Civil War had begun. Part 5, The War. What followed, between July 1967 and January 1970, became one of the most devastating conflicts of the 20th century, and one the wider world, even today, remembers far less than it should. The war was fought on conventional military lines at first. Federal forces advancing into Biafran territory, Biafran forces fighting to hold ground with a fraction of the federal government's resources, weaponry, and international support. But the conflict's most devastating weapon was never a bullet. It was hunger. As federal forces gained ground, they increasingly encircled Biafran territory, cutting off access to food, medicine, and supplies. The federal government, under the strategic direction of figures including a young army officer named Obasanjo, treated the economic blockade as a legitimate tool of war, a way to force Biafran surrender without prolonged conventional fighting across every front. The human cost of that blockade was almost incomprehensible. Images of starving Biafran children, their bodies wasted by kwashiorkor, a severe protein deficiency disease, their stomachs distended, their eyes hollow, began appearing in newspapers and television broadcasts around the world. For many people outside Africa, these images were among the first widely circulated photographs of famine, as a deliberate consequence of modern warfare, and they shocked international public opinion in ways that would influence humanitarian response to conflicts for decades afterward. Estimates of the total death toll during the Biafran War range enormously, from approximately 1 million to as high as 3 million people. The overwhelming majority of these deaths were not combat casualties. They were civilians, disproportionately children, who died of starvation and disease as a direct consequence of the blockade. International reaction was deeply divided. Some nations, including France and several other countries, provided varying degrees of support or sympathy to Biafra, in some cases supplying arms or facilitating humanitarian relief efforts. Britain and the Soviet Union, an unlikely alignment born of very different strategic interests, both supported the Nigerian federal government, supplying weapons that allowed federal forces to maintain their military advantage throughout the war. Humanitarian organizations, including a newly formed group that would later become Médecins Sans Frontières, mobilized in response to the famine, marking one of the first instances of large-scale international humanitarian intervention, explicitly built around the principle that civilians trapped in a war zone deserved protection, regardless of which side controlled the territory they lived in. By late 1969 and into early 1970, Biafran territory had been reduced to a small, overwhelmed fraction of its original size, the population inside suffering from catastrophic levels of malnutrition and disease, the military situation entirely unsustainable. On January 15, 1970, almost exactly 3 years after the coup that had set this entire chain of events in motion, Biafra formally surrendered. Ojukwu fled into exile. The Republic of Biafra ceased to exist. No victor, no vanquished. In the immediate aftermath of the surrender, Gowon's federal government adopted an official policy summarized in the phrase, "No victor, no vanquished," a stated commitment to reconciliation rather than punishment, reintegration rather than retribution. In certain respects, this policy was genuinely significant. There were no mass war crimes tribunals. There was no systematic post-war execution of Biafran leadership. Many former Biafran soldiers and officials were eventually reintegrated into Nigerian public life, including some who would go on to hold senior positions in government and the military in subsequent decades. But for many Igbo survivors, the reality on the ground told a very different story than the official slogan suggested. The federal government implemented a currency policy that effectively wiped out the savings of Igbo families who had used Biafran currency during the war, exchanging it for Nigerian currency, at deeply unfavorable rates that left many former Biafrans
Independence
with a small
Nigeria
fraction
faced
of
its
their
first
pre-war
litmus
wealth.
test.
An abandoned property policy in many cases
census
resulted in
became a
homes,
battle of numbers.
businesses, and properties previously owned by Igbo people, particularly in non-Igbo regions, including parts of the East itself,
have to leave now
being
for the
reassigned to
children.
other claimants,
This is madness.
with many
We
Igbo
must go.
families never able to
tensions rise,
reclaim what they
families
had
are forced to
owned
flee
before
their
the
home.
war. Reconstruction investment in the war-devastated Southeast lagged significantly behind other regions in the years that followed, leaving much of Igboland to rebuild its shattered infrastructure with limited federal support relative to the scale of destruction it had experienced. And for decades afterward, there was no national day of mourning, no widely supported public memorial, no sustained national reckoning with what had happened between 1966 and 1970, not in the way the scale of the death toll might have demanded. The war ended, but for a significant portion of the Igbo population, the underlying question that had driven Ojukwu to declare independence in the first place, could Nigeria be trusted to treat the Igbo as equal and safe citizens, was never definitively answered. It was simply set aside, year after year, decade after decade, as the country moved forward without fully resolving it. Part 6. The Long Silence. For roughly 4 decades after the war's end, Biafra existed primarily as a private memory rather than a public political movement. Survivors carried their experiences quietly. Families who had lost
Listen,
relatives
my
to
children, story
starvation
of our
or violence
In the time of
passed those
Biafra, we
stories
saw
down
great
within
struggle,
households
but our
rather than through
resilience is
public
what kept us
commemoration.
alive.
Nigeria's national education curriculum gave minimal attention to the war's causes or its human cost, and several successive governments showed little appetite for revisiting the subject in any sustained, official way. This was not universal silence. Chinua Achebe's writing, including his late-career memoir, There Was a Country, kept elements of the Biafran experience in public literary discourse. Survivors' associations existed. Annual private memorials took place within Igbo communities. But at the level of national politics and mainstream public discourse, Biafra functioned for decades as an unresolved, largely unaddressed historical wound, discussed in hushed terms, rarely confronted directly in national policy or public reconciliation efforts. Meanwhile, many of the underlying grievances that had driven the original conflict did not disappear. They evolved. Successive decades brought continued frustration in parts of the Southeast over perceived underrepresentation in federal appointments, perceived underinvestment in regional infrastructure relative to other parts of the country, and a persistent sense among segments of the Igbo population that the principle of rotational power sharing at the presidential level, an unwritten political convention intended to balance influence between major regions, had, in practice, repeatedly disadvantaged the Southeast specifically. The oil wealth of the Niger Delta, much of it extracted from territory that had been within Biafra's borders, fueled the broader Nigerian economy. For decades, while many communities in the oil-producing region itself, including non-Igbo Delta communities, experienced severe environmental degradation and limited direct economic benefit, adding another layer of regional grievance to the broader picture. By the early 2010s, a generation had grown up that had not personally lived through the war, but had absorbed its memory through family stories, regional identity, and a persistent sense of unresolved injustice. This generation was also coming of age in an environment of new tools that the original Biafran movement never had access to: social media, diaspora connectivity, and instantaneous global broadcast capability. Into that environment stepped a man who had spent years building a platform far from Nigeria's shores. Part 7. The Rise of Nnamdi Kanu.
In 2009, a voice broke the silence. The story of the man who refused to let Nigeria forget.